The Nile River is 30 million years old. Let that number sit for a moment. 30 million years. When the Nile first began to flow, dinosaurs had already been extinct for 35 million years. The Himalayas were still rising from the ocean floor, and human beings would not exist for another 29 million years. This river has been flowing longer than our entire species can imagine. But here is the question that nobody seems to want to answer. If the Nile is 30 million years old, and the first humans appeared along its banks almost 200,000 years ago, and ancient Egypt only began 5,000 years ago, what was happening here for the other 195,000 years? Who was living beside this river? What did they build? And why does almost none of it appear in any history book? In the next 18 minutes, we are going to travel back through time, not to ancient Egypt, not to the pyramids, not to the pharaohs. Further, much further, to a time when the Sahara Desert was a green paradise, when a civilization lived beside the Nile that nobody gave a name to, that nobody put in a textbook, that nobody remembered, because by the time Egypt rose to power, this civilization had already been gone for thousands of years. We know they existed, not because of legends, not because of mythology, because of what they left behind. A stone circle in the Nubian Desert that is older than Stonehenge by more than 1,000 years. A carved bone beside the headwaters of the Nile. That shows someone was doing mathematics 20,000 years ago. And a river, 30 million years old, that according to scientists at the University of Texas, should have turned west and disappeared long ago, but didn't, as if it was waiting for something or someone. The story of Egypt does not begin with the pharaohs. It begins with what came before them, and what came before them is one of the most extraordinary untold stories in human history. Rivers move, not quickly, not in human lifetimes, but over millions of years. Every major river on Earth has changed course. The Amazon has shifted. The Mississippi has wandered. The Colorado carved the Grand Canyon and kept moving. The Nile has not moved. In 30 million years, the Nile has followed essentially the same northward path, through the same valleys, toward the same sea. For geologists, this is deeply unusual. In 2019, a team of researchers at the University of Texas published their findings in Nature Geoscience. Their conclusion: the Nile is at least 30 million years old, 6 times older than anyone had previously believed. But the more interesting discovery was why. The answer lies deep beneath the surface, in the mantle. Beneath the African continent, a specific pattern of mantle movement has been acting like a conveyor belt, pushing up the Ethiopian highlands in the south, pulling the surface downward in the north, creating a permanent invisible ramp that has kept the Nile flowing north for 30 million years. Lead researcher Professor Claudio Facena stated it plainly. If not for the mantle movement keeping the river on course, the Nile would have turned west long ago, probably changing the course of history along with it. If the mantle had moved differently, the Nile would have turned west, into the Sahara, and disappeared. No Nile, no fertile valley, no Egypt, no pyramids, no civilization as we know it. The entire history of northeastern Africa depends on a pattern of rock movement deep inside the earth that began 30 million years before the first human being ever stood beside the river. The answer to what came before Egypt begins not in Egypt at all, but in a dried lake bed in the Nubian Desert, where someone built something extraordinary, thousands of years before the pharaohs existed. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert did not exist, not as we know it. The largest desert on Earth was a landscape of grasslands, lakes, and rivers, home to giraffes, crocodiles, hippos, and people, millions of people. Scientists call this period the African Humid Period. Between 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, a shift in the Earth's axial tilt pushed monsoon rains further north. A megalake covering 42,000 square miles spread across what is now barren desert. Rivers connected it to the Nile. We know this not from legends, not from mythology, but from rock art. Painted onto cave walls across the Sahara are images of animals that have not lived in this region for thousands of years. Giraffes, elephants, cattle, swimming humans, in a desert where the nearest water is hundreds of kilometers away. German explorer Heinrich Barth documented these paintings in the 1850s, animals that made no sense in a desert landscape. Because when these paintings were made, there was no desert. Then around 5,000 years ago, everything changed. The Earth's axial tilt shifted, the monsoons retreated south, and the green Sahara began to die. Fast, terrifyingly fast by geological standards. Lakes dried up, rivers disappeared, grasslands became dust, and the millions of people who had built their lives across this landscape had one option: move toward the only reliable water source left, the Nile. Here is what makes this remarkable. The timing of the Sahara's desertification matches almost exactly the sudden explosion of Egyptian civilization. Around 3100 BC, Egypt unified, cities appeared, writing emerged, monumental architecture began, all within a very short period. The people who built ancient Egypt did not appear from nowhere. They arrived, carrying thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, agricultural techniques, astronomical understanding, social organization, all developed across the green Sahara before a single stone of a pyramid was ever laid. Egypt was not a beginning, it was a destination. But among the people who made this journey, one group had already been doing something remarkable, something that would not be matched anywhere else in the world for another 1,000 years. They had been watching the stars and recording what they saw in stone. In 1973, a group of scientists were driving across the Nubian Desert in southern Egypt. They stopped, not because they had reached their destination, but because they needed a bathroom break, 800 kilometers south of Cairo, in the middle of one of the most desolate landscapes on Earth. Professor Fred Wendorf of Southern Methodist University stepped out of the vehicle and noticed something in the sand. Stones, arranged in a pattern. He looked closer, then closer still, and realized that what he was standing in the middle of had been placed there deliberately by human hands a very long time ago. The site is called Nabta Playa. In the center stands a stone circle, small by Stonehenge standards, but older, much older. Nabta Playa's stone circle dates to approximately 7,000 years ago. Stonehenge was built around 5,000 years ago. The people at Nabta Playa were arranging stones in precise astronomical alignments, 1,000 years before the first stone at Stonehenge was moved. In 1998, archaeoastronomer Professor J. McKim Malville published a landmark paper. The stone alignments at Nabta Playa, he found, pointed directly toward major stars: Sirius, Arcturus, Alpha Centauri. The circle itself marked the summer solstice with precision. These were not primitive people randomly placing rocks. These were astronomers, tracking stars with enough accuracy that their alignments still work today. Point a modern star chart at the positions Nabta Playa marks, and the stars are exactly where the stones say they should be. The people who built this were nomadic cattle herders. No cities, no writing, no metal tools, and yet they built a functional astronomical observatory more than 7,000 years ago. Nabta Playa is listed on UNESCO's inventory of archaeoastronomical sites. It is recognized, documented, verified, and almost nobody has heard of it. Which brings us to a question archaeologists rarely ask out loud. If people were sophisticated enough to build observatories 7,000 years ago, what were people doing beside this river 20,000 years ago? The answer was found not in Egypt, not in the Sahara, but in the Democratic Republic of Congo, beside a small river that feeds directly into the Nile. In 1950, Belgian geologist Jean de Heinzelin de Brocourt was excavating a site near the Semliki River in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, a small tributary that feeds into the headwaters of the Nile. He found a bone, small, dark brown, about 10 centimeters long, the fibula of a baboon, with markings, deliberate, carefully carved markings, arranged in 3 distinct columns, 168 notches in total, grouped, organized, structured. They were not random, they were not decorative, they followed a mathematical pattern. The first column contained prime numbers between 10 and 20, 11, 13, 17, 19. The third column showed numbers consistent with a base 12 counting system, The same system that gives us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day. The mathematical framework that still governs how we measure time today may trace its origins to markings on a baboon bone found beside a tributary of the Nile. When the site was dated using advanced techniques, the number was staggering. The Ishango bone is approximately 20,000 years old. At a time when humans in Europe were painting cave walls with their hands, at a time when the woolly mammoth still walked the continent, someone beside a Nile tributary was working with prime numbers and recording them on a bone. Mathematician Amir Axel called it certainly the best early example of pre-counting in human history. Vladimir Pletzer of the European Space Research and Technology Center concluded the notches suggest logic reasoning was being performed at a level with no parallel anywhere in the world at that time. The Ishango bone is currently held in the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences in Brussels. It is not on permanent display. Most people who study the history of mathematics never encounter it in their textbooks. A 20,000-year-old record of mathematical thinking, found beside the headwaters of the Nile, sits in a storage facility in Belgium, while the history of mathematics officially begins in Mesopotamia, 5,000 years ago, 15,000 years later. There is a word for what happens when inconvenient evidence is placed in storage and removed from the curriculum. But we will let you decide what that word is. What the Ishango bone tells us is not just that mathematics is older than we thought. It tells us that the people living beside the Nile were intellectually sophisticated 20,000 years before Egypt existed. The answer is not primitive hunter-gatherers stumbling through the dark. The answer is people, thinking, counting, recording, watching the stars, for a very long time. But perhaps no discovery tells this story more powerfully than what archaeologists found when they looked at Egypt itself, before the pharaohs arrived. Here is what the official history of Egypt tells us. Around 3100 BC, a king named Narmer unified Upper and Lower Egypt. Writing appeared. Cities formed. Civilization started. Here is what archaeology actually found. The earliest confirmed evidence of continuous human habitation along the Nile Valley goes back 195,000 years. Not a migration passing through, not a temporary camp. Continuous habitation, generation after generation, living beside this river for 190,000 years before anyone built a pyramid, 70,000 years ago. Researchers from the Royal Ontario Museum excavated an ancient workshop south of Dongola in Sudan. Not a cave, not a campsite, a workshop containing thousands of stone axes arranged in rows on flat stones. These were not people surviving day to day. These were people with systems, with organization. 70,000 years before the first Egyptian dynasty, between 18,000 and 15,000 BC, the Halfan culture appeared along the Nile. They developed the first known sickles in human history to harvest wild grain along the Nile's banks. The first grain harvesting tools on Earth appeared beside the Nile, 15,000 years before Egypt. At Nabta Playa, archaeologists found something beneath the stone circle, buried cattle, not randomly disposed of, deliberately buried in carefully prepared clay-lined chambers, with grave goods placed beside them. This is ritual burial. This is organized religion. 7,000 years ago, 2,000 years before Egypt unified, when the Sahara began its final desertification around 3,500 BC, these communities moved toward the Nile Valley. They arrived with cattle herding traditions, astronomical knowledge, organized religious practices, mathematical systems, thousands of years of accumulated social organization, and within a few centuries of their arrival, Egyptian civilization exploded into existence. Archaeologist Michael Hoffman spent decades studying pre-dynastic Egypt. His conclusion was direct. The origins of Egyptian civilization must be sought within its North African context. Egypt did not begin with Narmer. Egypt began with the first human being who stood beside the Nile, looked at the water flowing north, and decided to stay, 195,000 years ago. And yet, almost none of this appears in the history books that most people read. Which brings us to the question this entire video has been building toward. Not what was here before Egypt. We now know the answer to that. But why? Does almost no one know it? We came here today with one question. The Nile is 30 million years old. So what was here before Egypt? And the answer is everything. People standing beside this river 195,000 years ago. A workshop organized with thousands of stone tools. 70,000 years before the first pharaoh. The first grain harvesting tools on Earth. Developed beside the Nile 15,000 years before Egypt existed. An astronomical observatory tracking Sirius and Alpha Centauri. 1,000 years before Stonehenge was built. A bone recording prime numbers and mathematical sequences. 20,000 years ago. The reason most people don't know what was here before Egypt is not because the evidence doesn't exist. The evidence exists. It has been excavated, dated, published. The reason most people don't know is because the story of human civilization has traditionally been told from a very specific starting point. Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, the so-called cradle of civilization, and everything that doesn't fit that starting point gets filed away, placed in storage, left out of the curriculum, not because it isn't real, but because it complicates a story that someone decided should be simple. The Nile has been flowing for 30 million years. It has watched everything. It watched the green Sahara bloom and die. It watched the first human beings stand on its banks and look north toward the sea. It watched astronomers arrange stones in the desert to track stars they would never fully understand. It watched a civilization compress thousands of years of knowledge into the Nile Valley and call itself Egypt. And it is still flowing today. North, always north. The pyramids will eventually crumble. The Sphinx will eventually erode. The names of the pharaohs will eventually be forgotten. But the Nile will keep flowing, because 30 million years ago, something deep inside the earth decided that this river mattered. And whatever was here before Egypt understood that long before we did. If this is the kind of history you want to keep exploring, the kind that goes deeper than the textbooks, Enigma Science exists for exactly this reason. Subscribe, because what we look at next makes the story of Egypt look recent.